most people seem to have made a good attempt in the class responses slide, and I hope you've also had your 2-minute break. So we will proceed. So now, once your student has got started off and you found a problem which kind of seems like going in the right direction and so on, the questions for the next stage arise. So again, what should be your concerns at this stage? Your student is progressing along the research towards a PhD. So what should be your concerns at this stage? So same Mentimeter activity we will carry out. There are 70 participants and almost 30 responses. I'll wait for a few more. Okay. Now looking at the responses, the first most important, according to most people, seems to be that looking into, are the details working out as anticipated? Second one is there sufficient rigor in the work? The third one is, where is the novelty in the work? Fourth one is, what is the publications plan? And the fifth one is, what will the student do after graduation? So once again it turns out that the ranking that you have done closely matches the ranking that I would do. So that in this case indicates that we are thinking along similar lines for guiding the student. So we know that there is no single correct answer though. So individually you might, one or two options may go up or down, but it's very unlikely that, the options will go very far away from each other. So let's look at what are my main concerns. This is kind of summarizing the ranking that you have done. So in the middle, which is year 3 or 4, in case it's a 5-year PhD, or it could even be year 1.5 to 2 for a shorter PhD. The primary concern that I have is, are the details working out as planned? The second question is there sufficient rigor or depth? And is there sufficient volume and breadth? The third question is there sufficient progress? Is the student on track? So this is an important one, and we'll talk a little bit more about this. Then the question arises, can I see the finish line for the PhD? However distant, as a guide, I need to be able to see that yes, this will go for a PhD, or we have to be, so that's the whole idea of calling it cruising, that you have to be able to say that yes, this is likely to go the whole way. Some other questions that I worry about at this stage is how to provide opportunities for the student to do useful internships. Maybe go to a different lab for a short time, or in some cases maybe work with an NGO to help them strengthen their work as well as somewhat broaden their understanding and knowledge. So around this time, I start thinking about, has the student got a plan for what to do after the PhD? Okay. So the main recommendation here is that in the middle, we don't want to continue in exploration mode. So many students may feel that they will hit upon the idea. At some point, we have to say that, okay, we have done enough exploration. Now let's just pick a reasonable research problem that may work for a thesis and solve it. So this is one point where student and guide may have to do some realignment of their priorities as well as realignment of their position. For example, if the student has been floundering and the guide has a ready-made problem, this might be a good time to say, hey, look, we spent enough time exploring, now here is a ready-made problem, let's just get this done. So this is the time to focus on details and get some thesis related publications going. Okay, so now question comes, what to do to speed up the student's progress, right? This is a very common question, and there are some do's and don'ts that I follow. One is, I create templates for standard tasks, So this is very useful because often as guides we find ourselves repeating the same thing again and again to each batch of students. So while we don't want to make the templates very rigid, they are a useful way for getting started. So instead of repeating the entire thing, giving a template to a student and then working on how to customize the template for that student is a useful way. The other thing that I do is I connect them to relevant senior students or alumni. Now this is a highly untapped pool of expertise. So when you connect them to relevant seniors or alumni who have worked on similar problems, the connect between the students also increases and they are also able to, so it also gives the alumni a feeling of contribution back to the department. Also encourage them to discuss with their peers, have some small conclaves where they are discussing each other's problems or simply sit in on other students' discussions. Okay, so while it may seem that it is a deviation from spending time on their own work, what this actually does is it strengthens the students' knowledge of the various techniques, how others are approaching solving their research problems, and eventually it does speed up the students' progress. What I don't do is to assume that student will be able to operationalize high level instructions. So what do I mean by high level instructions is like go figure out what have other people done in this area or do this analysis. So the student may not yet have got the required skill to simply take a instruction like do this analysis and know what exactly is to be done. So this is where again connecting them to relevant seniors or alumni comes in very useful. The other thing that I don't do is to insist that progress should happen as per my expectations. Okay, so I will come to why this is so in a moment. Okay, so what do I do to keep a student on track? Here again there are some do's and don'ts that I follow for myself. Feel free to adopt whichever ones you think may work for you and your student and ignore the rest. So what I do is I discuss goals and milestones regularly with the student, saying okay, where are we trying to go, what should be our milestones. Also have weekly meetings, however small the progress. So that is again a thing that I have found to be useful for keeping in connect with the student. I also ask them to make PPTs or write documents, however sparse it may be. And this is an important one. I focus more on what they have done right than on the lapses. So this is important because we must keep in mind that the student is doing that activity for the first time. As an established researcher, we may know the technique very well or we may know the process very well and we may be impatient with somebody who is going through it for the first time. So too much of negative feedback actually pulls down a student and impedes progress. That does not mean that you have to keep praising the student all the time. So what is important is to identify what are they doing right and build on that. Okay, what I don't do is wait for the student to initiate meeting requests. Again, I'll come to it in a moment. Or micromanage with respect to timelines and deliverables. So both of these points are important, and let me just talk about why it's important. Okay, so this is also often something that happens, that a student is sometimes not on track. Okay. So why I don't micromanage is because there may be other factors at play. So it is useful to assess if there are other factors at play. There could be some constraints, there could be some health issues. So while we don't want to know the details, nor do we want to breach privacy, it is important as a guide to know that okay, broadly there are some other things that the student is dealing with, and that's why the progress is not happening at the mutually decided pace. So what I found is that it's not useful to judge or label the student as bad or slow simply because they were not able to meet a deadline, or simply because they are not progressing either in terms of the quantum of work or in terms of their thinking depth at the rate that we expect them to progress on. So I often say it's okay if you haven't made much progress. Come for a meeting, let's talk. Okay. So this is a very important thing that I have found, and it's very useful. So why do I say that? This is because students often feel that you expect to see significant progress in each meeting. Okay. So this is a trap, because then students get into a spiral of thinking that okay, I will do some more work and meet the guide next week or in the next meeting. And all that happens is that they fall further and further behind. Okay. So eventually there is a mountain of guilt that is built up for the student to come and meet you, and they start avoiding the guide. Okay, so that is a situation that you do not want to get into. So the recommendation here is that, as more and more time passes without tangible progress, this may happen for a variety of reasons. What will it result in is that the stress will increase. Okay, so as a guide, what you have to do is you have to periodically reset this and revise the plan. So that is the reason why I often say that okay, come for a meeting, let's talk. Sometimes some small amount of progress happens in the meeting itself. That also is fine, because that also gives the student that okay, instead of staying at the same place, I have moved ahead a little bit. Okay, so once again let me tell some stories. Student S4 had everything going. Okay, the problem was defined, the solution was done, but the student would not stay on track. So I started with being understanding and cajoling, so that's the usual approach that I take, saying that okay, why don't you just get it done and so on. And then you become slowly harsher and harsher, and at some point I started talking about consequences and escalating the matter and so on. So it turned out that nothing worked. So eventually I got the students' peers to do an intervention, okay, in the sense that they got together and they kind of talked to him and supported him and so on. And what I did was I kept the option for the student to resume. So it was as good as that the thesis had got paused at a particular point. Okay. Now instead of continuing to put pressure on the student, I kept the option for the student to resume, and the thesis got done. It did take a little longer, but it did get done. So another student, S5, was working as a college teacher and unable to make regular progress as per plan despite a sincere approach. So I asked what is going on in other aspects of your life, and discovered that their college load had become too much. So again here, sometimes students hesitate to tell you that their college load has become too much, or they feel that I must put in as much effort or I must show as much progress as other students who are doing a full-time PhD. Okay, so that kind of gets in the way of actual progress. So what we did in this case was we revised the PhD plan and we made peace with the delayed graduation. So it's actually a trade-off between your own mental health and taking a little longer to graduate from the PhD. So it is possible that your peers who have joined at the same time graduate a bit earlier than you, but attempting to keep the pace or attempting to rush the pace at the cost of your own mental health is not worth it. So in this case also the thesis got done with more time. Student S6 had a tendency to volunteer for too many secondary projects. Okay. So here again I had to discuss PhD milestones and implications regularly. Okay. So without being very harsh, I had to keep pointing out to the student that look, we already have so many tasks, you are in the cruising stage, and now if you get distracted by secondary projects, it's not likely to be very fruitful and it's going to delay your graduation and so on. So the student eventually got the message, decided to put a pause on the secondary projects, and again the thesis got done on time. So the purpose of sharing these stories is also to help you identify, the students that you work with, and if they fit in some of these personas, you can attempt to follow similar strategies. So here the main point I keep in mind is to acknowledge that students have their own lives and their own constraints. So I don't put undue pressure on them to somehow meet the timelines that I have already set for them, like for example paper deadline. So sometimes it does happen that we choose a conference or a journal deadline to meet, and sometimes it is really difficult for the student to meet that constraint. So instead of attempting a half done job, we let go of that deadline. Okay, one more activity now for you. So this is another second part of the assignment. So now your student is progressing along on the research towards the PhD, cruising along, and you are also aware of the concerns during this stage. So what would be your broad strategy during the student's third year? So here again, instead of writing in very generic terms, try to anticipate specific scenarios in your research area. What sort of experiments is the student likely to get stuck in? What help might the student need? Think about all that and write down your answers for your strategy that you would use with your student in the third year, in the middle stage of the PhD. So again, you have 5 minutes to do this activity, and you may share your answers in the class responses.